All right, welcome back to Radio Wasteland. That welcome back is both to you, the audience, and to our guest tonight, Jonathan Weiss, Weiss,
Got
of Jonathan Weiss Tours. We're talking, we had Jonathan on not too long ago. We were talking about New Orleans, and I know I don't say, but okay, so this is a constant thing that goes on TV. Let me back up. Tonight, we're talking about women in New Orleans, but I gotta say, this is a constant thing that goes on. How does somebody from New Orleans pronounce it, and how does somebody who's not from New Orleans, how are they supposed to pronounce it?
There's different pronunciations depending on what part of the city you're from, but generally it's going to be New Orleans, N''ORLINS, or New Orleans, which is closest to the original French, or New Orleans. Almost like N-E-W with a little apostrophe O-R-L-I-N-S. Those are the three major pronunciations of the city's name. If you say Nowlands, we want to smack you immediately.
New Orleans?
Nowlands. Come on, y'all to Nowlands. That makes us crazy. But yeah, we have all kinds of verbal tricks and cues to tell if people are actually from New Orleans or not. From the way we pronounce our streets to the words we use to describe common events, there's tons and tons of verbal little tricks all throughout our specific version of Southern American English. Well, so it's kind of fun.
It makes me think a lot of England, how they can tell like which parts of London, which parts of London you're from based off of your accent. Oh, yeah. Apparently that's
by the way you pronounce words. Yeah. By the turns of phrase you use. It's really kind of cool because you're right. London's homogenized a lot since the 80s, but New Orleans still has its very specific little things. I'm kind of pleased by that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's cool because it holds on to the history. And, speaking of the history and the little things, when I saw this topic, I couldn't help but to think the first thing that popped into my head was in a history where women have been, well, without a doubt, the most marginalized group throughout all of history would be women. New Orleans seems to have this underbelly, this underground, and I can't help but to think that was like a festering, maybe festering's not the right word, but an area for women to do things that maybe they weren't able to do in other parts of the world because of this sort of secretive underground.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's secretive as much as it's just a completely different cultural point of view than the rest of the United States, or the rest of what became the United States. And it had very much to do with, I think it had a lot to do with the fact that we were such a raw frontier for so long. There were not enough women here by any means. When we got founded, there were just not any women. So literally, there were schemes to trick, entice, and import women from France to the savage New World, including these amazingly detailed fake posters about what they could expect when they arrived in this beautiful paradise called La Nouvelle Lyon.
Oh, no.
Oh my God, it was fantastic. I've seen a reproduction of one of the posters, and it genuinely shows you a complete fantasy. Because in the 1730s, New Orleans, we're mostly below sea level in southern Louisiana. New Orleans didn't have any paving in the streets till 1888. So essentially the streets were open sewers. The houses were made from busted up boats and barges. So the planks didn't fit right. You chinked them with mud and moss. The floors were generally made of dirt, and the roofs are made of wood shingles. But when it rains heavily, like it does in southern Louisiana, the wood shingles would essentially just sip the water evenly over the entire floor of your house, leaving a mud pit surrounded by a wooden shack. It was an absolute festering pit, and the men of the time would look a lot like the extras from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
Right.
So the poster is just an absolute fantasy creation that shows beautiful cobblestone streets and stately two-story townhomes as far as you can see. And the foreground, two gentlemen. Now this would be the late Three Musketeer time. So these men would be fancy with the long curling wigs and the high buckled shoes, frock coats. These men have their arms linked and they're strolling the boulevard of a fictitious city, looking at the viewer with the most French face you could ever imagine. And the best of all, the background, the snow-capped mountains of southern Louisiana rose up to kiss the sky.
Oh God.
Yes. Snow-capped mountains, southern Louisiana. There was not an innocent word in that whole sentence.
Yeah.
So I guess that is the beginning of the rebelliousness of women when they showed up. I can imagine that they showed up and they were all, oh hell no.
Yeah, our first women actually were from the prisons of France.
Oh really?
Oh yeah.
So
They
they
emptied
fit
the
right
prisons
in.
out. They emptied the prisons of pickpockets, the homeless, mentally ill. They emptied the prisons, of course, of prostitutes, and they all sent them here to be wives. A city of prostitutes being poured into a city of savages to be good wives. Can you imagine how well that went?
Yes, I can. It sounds like a lot of it sounds like post-apocalyptic movies that I would like. It sounds like some sort of
Honestly,
like Mad Max premise.
I don't think that would be too bad of a comparison, to be very honest with you.
All right, so when we had you on the first time, we talked a bit about Marie Laveau, and let's skim over her real quick for anybody who hasn't seen her. But we'll talk about some of the other ones as well. But
Sure.
Marie Laveau, I think, is probably the most famous name that's coming out of there when we sort of think of scary
New Orleans, yeah.
New Orleans and women.
Mhm.
Is she worthy of this sort of scary title that comes with her?
I think so. I mean, she would have wielded an immense amount of power for a woman in the 19th century, mid 19th century, let alone a Black woman in the mid 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
She was an extremely astute businesswoman. She was a hairdresser by trade, and she also was essentially, recognized voodoo priestess. In New Orleans, the voodoo priestesses were all referred to as queens, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, though, imagine the high society ladies of New Orleans who have their hairdresser over for their little, get-togethers. It's going to be Marie Laveau, and they find out that she's a queen of voodoo. Oh, Lord, this is so exciting. She's a queen. She's royalty.
Mm.
So she really knew how to work the expectations of the white people around her, the high society around her. Of course, she was raised in this milieu, so she understood people intimately. And I think that she was not only a very clever, very strong marketer of her own brand. I mean, literally, she was her own brand. But she's also a very well-respected priestess of voodoo. And she was feared, no doubt at all. The white population feared her, the Black population feared her because they did not want to risk her displeasure. So she was extremely powerful and extremely influential in a time where women and Black women were essentially non-entities, or I guess considered not quite citizens or not quite even human.
Right.
So she was, I think, a very interesting and powerful character. But we do actually have something of a tradition of very strong free Black women in New Orleans. That's not a joke at all. I mean, that's stories like John Bunyan and Pecos Bill, these legendary kind of tall tale characters of early America, Johnny Appleseed. There's one here named Annie Christmas. Annie Christmas was a free Black woman who was almost 7 feet tall and could carry a barrel of flour under each arm and one on her head. She could load a flatboat all by herself in a single day. It said that she was so strong. She was so tough and strong. She dressed like a man, but she wore a pearl necklace around her neck. But each pearl represented some man that she'd beaten down. Huh. So yeah, and this is a pre-Civil War character up and down the Mississippi River, talked about amongst slaves and free Blacks alike as being, essentially a patroness, a giantess in her own time. A woman who did not need a man, but a woman who's as strong as a man, but a woman who bore, I think they said 12 sons, each one bigger and stronger than the last one. Goodness. So, I mean, it's such a shame that characters like that have kind of faded away in our consciousness.
Right.
But I mean, that's a wonderful legendary character. That's a free Black woman who runs her own business. She was a keelboat captain on the Mississippi River. And I think that's just one of the coolest stories that nobody really knows about. So we do have a tradition of strong free Black women. Mother Henriette de Lille was another free Black woman, descended from the Creole class. That means she'd be descended of the French and Spanish original settlers of the area. Mm-hmm. But she was also, I think, 1/8 African. So she'd been certainly noted as a Black woman in birth records, even though she was free. But she founded the first order of nuns. The first Black American woman to found an order of nuns in the 19th century. And she was very influential in education. She ministered to the poor. She taught slaves and free blacks how to read, from children to adults, taught them literacy and numbers. She was very much a rebel for her time, because I haven't been able to get a whole lot of information about it, but her class, she would be considered to be born to a class of women called placé. Placé comes from the French word, which literally means to be in a place. So placés would literally be kept women of a place.
Oh.
And these were the free black mistresses of the white Creoles of New Orleans. So that was like a class, like a geisha class. Your daughter is raised up by a placé to be a placé, to learn how to dress, how to do her makeup discreetly, how to run a household, how to converse, how to be polite society, because she's destined to become a companion of a wealthy French or Spanish gentleman. And she was very much rebellious in that class and time. She demanded on joining holy orders, and she finally did it at the age of 21.
Wild. So there you're saying, I'm botching words that you were saying that we hear out here. Are you saying what I would know of as Creole when you're saying that she's Creole?
Creole has different meanings. Traditionally, it would mean anything that's from Europe, like France or Spain, that's born in the New World. So you'd have Creole people would be people who are of the French and Spanish stock that were born in the New World. That's what Creole originally meant. Now it's evolved essentially to mean people who are distinctly of Native American, African, and European blood lineage mixed.
I see.
So
because that's what I know of it as, but I
Right.
see what you're saying. Right.
That's what it means now. But originally it meant people who were descended from the original settlers.
It's really interesting that that we have such a specific pocket of culture here. The United States is so big, and we kind of think of ourselves as one big country, although here recently we seem to be thinking otherwise, as two different countries. But I think about it with a comparison to Europe, and like I grew up in Southern California, then I moved to Northern California, and the distance to do that is like traveling through three countries in Europe, three very drastic different cultures, and I don't think the United States gets we seem to be in between. Is a state a country with its own culture, and are we the United States? Are we this sort of globalized view of, hey, we're all this way? It's very interesting that New Orleans seems to have very well held on to its pocket of culture in a world that's trying to take that away.
Well, I mean, the joke that's not a joke is that we've been at war with America for more than 200 years. Because we didn't want to be Americans. The French and Spanish were absolutely appalled to become Americans. They hated Americans so much they were not even allowed in our homes. And we wouldn't sell them a single inch of ground in the city of New Orleans, which essentially was the French Quarter. So they actually had to buy a plantation across what is now Canal Street and build their own settlement. So generally, Canal Street was a dividing line between the Creoles, the Europeans, and the Americans. And the little strip of ground that goes between two lanes of a street that you call the median in New Orleans is to this day called the neutral ground, because that's where the French and the American businessmen would meet to conduct business. They had to do business with each other, but they didn't like each other. So they just met in the neutral ground. And to this day, the median in the rest of the United States is called a neutral ground in New Orleans, all over the city.
Is there any of that left?
Oh, yeah. Uptowners and downtowners really honestly don't mix and don't get along very well. They don't trust each other very much.
Interesting.
Yeah, that is wild.
Too, because when downtowners go uptown, they can always spot somebody from downtown. It's just, I guess we're a little more overt, a little less American, a little more flamboyant, a little louder, a little more cheerful. I think we probably tip better too.
Right. Oh, that's good.
But yeah, it's still very much a divided city. Even
more attractive.
All these years later. Well, c'est that moment, obviously. I didn't want to go. Thank you, Kara, for Did you have a question about anything about the women?
Yeah. So, on your tour, how many women do people hear about on your tour?
It really kind of depends. There's just generally, it's a blessing. There's so many amazing and interesting women in New Orleans history in 300 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so many we don't know about, which drives me crazy. You know, okay, every once in a while I will find one and I'm like, oh my God, this woman is the coolest one in the history of the world. But it just kind of depends. I mean, you know, I think I mentioned before, my tours generally have to do with time and route. So I will put as many stories as I can, to be honest with you. That's why I encourage people to ask me questions, because the more questions you ask like this, you know, I can just kind of freestyle it, if you will.
Exactly.
Right.
And I can answer specific questions or give people a better contextual grip on a culture, time, place, or person. So it's, you know, as many as I could talk about. I could easily put a dozen women into a tour. I could put many more than that. It kind of depends, just like I said, on time, and also I think what my group is interested in.
Right.
We've got everything from genuinely murderous prostitutes in our city to fantastic folklore characters like Annie Christmas, to genuinely powerful women, temporally powerful women like Marie Laveau, to absolute savage psychopaths like Delphine Lalaurie, to sainted mothers like Mother Anne Adélie. So I mean, it's everything, man. It's a gamut. And this, keep in mind, this would all be in the 1 mile by 1/2 mile.
Right.
Yeah.
It's crazy, but it's absolutely just one of the most amazing things to realize how many women. Oh, and I didn't even mention the Verness Portalba. If you go to New Orleans, if you look at pictures of New Orleans, you're almost always going to see the same picture. And it's the picture of Jackson Square with the cathedral, and Andrew Jackson waving his hat in the air as he, you know, salutes his troops for victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans. That square was actually designed and paid for by a woman.
Oh,
How?
interesting.
In the 1850s.
Yeah, how? You know, how is she able to do that at the time?
She was extremely rich and extremely powerful, and from a very old, literally Spanish-French nobility line. So that carried a ton of weight in New Orleans, right? Because she's Creole as Creole can be, right? Her name was Verness Micaela Amoresti Putalba. And if you look at the beautiful red brick buildings on either side of Jackson Square, and you look at the Spanish lace, you know, the little ironwork on the galleries, you're going to see the letters A and P intertwined in all those galleries, because Almanesor y Puntalba, her last name's initials, and she designed them. She paid to have them built. She worked with the architects. She bought up all the one-story shanty, crappy shacks that would have been around Jackson Square originally, knocked them all down, and had those gorgeous buildings built around 1851. And you know, she was such an interesting and powerful woman. There was actually an opera written about her, which debuted in New Orleans about 10 years ago, called Puntalba. No, called Micaela. And yeah, she's just an absolute mind blower. Even Andrew Jackson, his statue, she's the one who essentially designed and kind of put the most influence into the design of the statue. You'll see Andrew Jackson with his hat off, right? Now, this may not be true. It's a traditional New Orleans apocryphal story, but it's said that when Andrew Jackson was here to defend the city against the British in 1815, young Baroness Micaela is riding along in her carriage. And apparently General Jackson was busy, or just probably thinking about, how do I save the city from the British? He didn't notice her, and he didn't tip his hat. And that somewhat infuriated the young lady. And allegedly she held a grudge for 4 decades. So when she had that statue designed, he's designed with his hat off, clearly, so he'll forever be tipping his hat to the Baroness.
That is funny.
Amazing.
It's probably not true.
Yeah.
But honestly, given her character, it could be true.
Right. It's one of those things we'll file it as true because we just want
because you want it to be true.
Right.
Because it's awesome.
Right.
Yeah, I was about to ask about like her personality, and it sounds like she was imperious and willful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The truth is, she was forced into a marriage with her cousin.
Oof.
She's of Spanish extraction. He's of French, literally of France. But she was a bossy woman. She was a headstrong woman, and he was kind of a weak-willed guy. So she just ran the roost. She told him what to do. Literally ran his life for him.
It's like my house.
His father was a very strong-willed man, and traditionally was used to running his son's life for him too. So of course they clashed. They butted heads. They went to visit his father's estates in France, and his father hated her so much that he came into the house he was letting me use with 4 pistols, shot her 3 times, and then when she lays on the floor bleeding, he pulled out a pistol and essentially atoned for the the scandal by shooting himself. Here's the joke. She survived.
Amazing.
Yeah. When you,
Perfect.
imperious and strong-willed, exactly who she was.
That is a lot like my house. Shot my wife through. No. I, however, on the flip side, I appreciate my wife running my life because I think I would starve and die of exposure without her. You know,
you'd starve in a nest of filthy clothes otherwise.
I would. Yeah. I was not hugely competent. Okay, so earlier you hit a note that Kara and I can only imagine we're both interested in, and that's murderous prostitutes.
Yes, please.
You know,
Dude, I knew that
We
would
want
get
to
you.
know about the savage psychopaths.
wait, savage psychopath was a different category. We
Oh,
have
okay.
murderous
Well, we'll
prostitute
hit
and
both.
savage
We'll hit both.
psychopath. You know,
Yeah, subdivisions. I feel like there's some overlap.
I'm sure there's some overlap, but let's go to
Definitely.
murderous prostitutes because I can imagine that, especially when you tell us the origin and them dumping the people here. You know,
I would kill people.
how's a woman
too.
get by?
You can't fault someone for a little murder under those circumstances.
Well, you know, obviously a lot of the women who were imported here went back to the trade. A lot of them did become wives, you know, because it's not the dream of every little girl to become a prostitute, obviously.
Of course.
And historically in New Orleans, we have, you know, I'm sure everybody is aware New Orleans has a reputation historically of being the Babylon, the pit of sin and vice.
Mm-hmm.
Always has. And as a result, you know, there's a never-ending supply of prostitutes in New Orleans for centuries. The last open house of prostitution in New Orleans was, I'm going to think, 1972.
Holy smokes.
I mean, technically it wasn't open, but, you know, everybody knew about it and the cops got paid off.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it works, right?
Right.
So the prostitutes in New Orleans, though, were, you know, most of their stories are gone in time. There's a wonderful photographer named Verness, who lived in New Orleans in the late 19th century. And he took pictures of the prostitute of Storyville. Storyville was our red light district. And only about 10 or 12 of his photographs survived because his brother was a Catholic priest and destroyed almost all the photographs after his death.
Figures.
But a few of them survived, and they are literally iconic photographs. So, you know, we can see these ladies in some cases. We can see pictures of some of the ladies. We have lots of descriptions. Of course, we have, you know, records. You would have to buy a license to run a house of prostitution. So we know who and where and when and where they were located in the city. So we have a lot of information in that respect. We also have a lot of stories that come down, like a lot of good stories in the South through word of mouth, through diaries, journals, letters, things like that from the past. But it was extremely, extremely difficult, extremely dangerous. I think most of the prostitutes in New Orleans probably died before they were 50. And, you know, from disease and violence.
Right, that's what I was
drug use, disease, and violence. I mean, there's just not a way to understand how dangerous New Orleans would have been historically. But you got to realize it is one of the biggest transient points in North America, and there's a big 200-foot deep river right next to it. So
that goes right out to the sea.
Yeah, the violence would have been absolutely off the scale in some areas of the city. I mean, beyond our willingness to comprehend. If you ever saw the movie Gangs in New York, it would be that level of squalor and violence.
Oh, really? I did see that.
Yeah, oh yeah,
I did.
absolutely. The 2-block area that's now called French Market Place, where we have, you know, a lot of tourists shop for souvenirs, that was called Gallatin Street, and it was considered from about 1840 to 1870 or so the most dangerous part of North America. A 2-block walk where the cops wouldn't go in. They would only go to the outskirts in wagons in groups of 5 during the daytime, and they would generally pick up the bodies that were dropped off there by the residents.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm not joking.
Crazy.
It was
crazy.
wild. And it had lots and lots, you know, brothels, of course, a lot of dance halls and taverns employed women. There were reports in the 1830s of dance halls along Gallatin Street where women were completely naked except for their shoes, dancing along. You know, I mean, it just blows your mind. What? The 19th century? Oh, yes, absolutely, in New Orleans. And a lot of these women had very, very short and miserable lives. There's some notorious ones. Bricktop Mary is probably the most infamous one, and her friend Bridget Fury. They were part of a group of prostitutes who by the late 1850s were so rowdy and violent they were essentially kicked out of Gallatin Street. So they moved a few blocks over to Dauphine and got a house together. So you have a bunch of women, and they're actually considered by many people America's first all-female street gang.
Oh.
Because they were vicious. Bricktop was infamous for Bricktop Mary killed 4 men that we know of with a knife by preference. She loved a knife so much, she had a knife smith make her a custom knife. So it had a central grip of German silver and a 5-inch blade on each end of it. So she could cut, stab, and slash in any direction without ever having to change the position of her hand. She designed that knife to be built for her to use on people. Some people call her a serial killer, along the lines of Eileen Wuornos. I don't think she was. I think she was just extremely violent, had a very short temper, no small amount of PTSD, and was in an extremely deadly place. But she was so tough. She said it was said she never lost a fight against a man or a woman ever in years.
Do we know how she got the nickname?
Bricktop?
Yeah,
as you might guess. Mary Jackson had flaming red hair.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. I wasn't sure if it was like some sort of like murderous thing, but
but she was plenty murderous. And, her roommate, her best friend Bridget Fury, she was a very strong, muscular woman. But there was another one named America Williams in their gang who was 6 feet tall, and just enormous and viciously strong and terrifying. So these women were just absolutely off the charts. One of the best stories about Bricktop and Bridget, they and a couple of probably other members of their gang were hanging out in a beer hall on Rampart Street. And you might guess they were salty in their language. So they're sitting there cursing away and just chattering amongst themselves. And apparently a gentleman at a table over asked them to mind their language, and they just kind of blew him off. And then he told them, he got up to tell them, shut up. To which something like Bricktop said something like, what are you going to do about it? He got up and he walked over and he slapped her.
Oof. Oops.
Yeah. Monsieur Fleury did not have a very good long life after that, because these three women immediately descend on him with knives and just cut him to ribbons. And a bartender came out and fired a shot from a pistol into the ceiling to try and drive them off. Mm-hmm. Oh, they ran out in the street, picked up bricks, and started throwing bricks at the bartender who had a pistol. The bartender runs away. I mean, one guy tries to intervene and to murder this man. He's got a vicious slash on his arm from Bricktop. He has to back off. They literally just butchered a man right there on Rampart Street, and everybody knew who they were. That's what actually sent her to prison finally. She got sentenced to, I think, 10 years for murder. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that the coroner apparently wouldn't say what had killed the gentleman. He decided it was heart failure.
Oh. So that's a trend that goes on today.
I imagine his heart did fail after he was cut into 40 different pieces.
But I mean, I think that gives you an idea how frightened people were of these women.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to risk the ire of these women at all. It's just going to be heart failure.
Right.
But after we got taken by the North in 1862, the military governor of Louisiana, the Union governor, essentially freed everybody from the prisons in New Orleans. And Bricktop took her opportunity and disappeared into history. So she's gone by about 1862, vanishes into history.
Love her.
It's pretty interesting. These women were characters beyond belief, but absolutely real.
Yeah, that sounds like a movie waiting to happen. Right?
I know, it's insane, isn't it?
Like Netflix, come on.
Yeah,
stop making
up the game.
Exactly.
It prompts the question, my wife is all about true crime, which a lot of wives are in this world. A lot of women, it seems to be a stereotype that's going around of true crime armchair detectives, of which my wife is one. I wonder what it is that we love so much about these murderous women, because one of the shows is, several of the shows are really just about women specifically. And, half of me sort of thinks that it's this sort of love of the underdog. And then the other half of it feels like it's the continued curse of Eve. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but, what do you think? Why do you think we love these murderous women so much?
I think it's because, I think no small degree, it's the underdog, it's the outlaw ethos, the thing that all Americans in theory admire and pride themselves on, individuality and rebelliousness. And, everybody has a fantasy that I could have done it. I could have lived in the Old West. I could have done that.
Right.
Real is almost everybody's going to die from like Starbucks within the first couple of days. But, but these women, I think it's because every hand was against them. Literally, every hand was against them. Every card was against them. Everything in their life was against them succeeding. But they fought, literally, clawed their way up, literally, and impacted other people's lives for good or ill in a way that would be absolutely shocking to most of the Victorian sensibilities the United States has suffered under in the past, couple hundred years. So I think that has a lot to do with it. That they are the ultimate rebel, successful rebel in many cases, like Marie Laveau, for example, or the Verness Montalvo. Admittedly, being born a child of wealthy nobility is a big advantage, but she did amazing things at a time where women were essentially told everywhere else just to sit down and shut up and look pretty.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that has a lot to do with it. The good underdog story that Americans love more than anything else.
And Americans also love murder. So
yeah. Well.
Oh yeah.
Peanut butter and
sex
chocolate.
And death.
Exactly.
Really are interested in sex and death.
Well, that's what I always say about movies is that I love sex and violence as much as any guy. I just like a movie with a plot to make me feel good about life. I don't want to watch a movie of just sex and violence. I need a plot there to make me feel somewhat civilized.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if it's not R-rated, I'm all, I don't know if I want to watch this,
Yeah, I think our city combines all three of those things very well. And it's the kind of thing we're trying to put out on the tours. Everything from my friend who helped me design the tour calls the cult of domesticity, which would have been where women of certain classes were not allowed to be merchants, not allowed to be shopkeepers, not allowed to be in business and trade. But a good example of that is during the Civil War, when all the men are off to fight, the women are not allowed to work. They have to maintain that cult of domesticity. So they kind of formed co-ops together where they would they do everything from sewing, quilts and things like that to baked goods, whatever they were doing. And then they would kind of sell them through, if you will, a neutral front shop, like a consignment store, if you will, which gave them the money to keep their families going while their husbands and their sons and their fathers are off to war. And they were able to keep providing for their families while maintaining the societally demanded idea of the genteel matron, the genteel lady. So everything from that to, entrepreneurs like Bricktop Mary and Bridget Fury to, it's just really amazing when you look at it, the wide variety of human stories. And most of them, a lot of the best ones have women involved in them. I think that's one of the coolest things.
I think one thing a lot of people are interested in when it comes to this is the voodoo. And of course we know Marie Laveau, are there other famous priestesses coming down? I think if there are outside of New Orleans, they sort of get lost in the gravity of Marie Laveau. But I assume throughout the years, there's been a vein of, is there a top priestess, and does that carry on today?
It's kind of a misnomer, top priestess. I would say that Marie Laveau was top priestess simply because of her influence,
right?
More than anything else. The voodoo tradition is still very strong here. The guy who does my voodoo tour, Roby, is from a long line of voodoo practitioners. He's the only person in the city who's actually a voodoo priest of both Louisiana and the Haitian style of the religion. And he, who does a tour. So, and his line comes from his mother. It comes down from that long family line of priestesses and priests in the voodoo tradition. And I think a lot of times people would know about them because, it was considered, nobody wants to have their religion mocked. Nobody wants to have their religion belittled and made fun of. And of course, Americans have done that to voodoo because, it's a little bit, it's obviously a racist thing,
right?
And misunderstood thing. But, big surprise, the voodoo practitioners generally are very circumspect, or at least traditionally have been for 100 years or more, simply because they didn't want to have stigma placed on them. And also it was their personal religion, nothing to be brooded about. It would be considered poor form in many of the voodoo communities to use your position to profit off other people.
Right.
That would be considered very much a negative thing to do. And it's not like people haven't done it, without a doubt. Human nature is human nature. But generally it'd be considered insulting the spirits, if you will. By you're giving these gifts by the spirits to help other people, not to glorify and enrich yourself. That would be the theory behind it, the idea behind it. So, there's some names we have, a few names floating around historically. Marie Laveau was allegedly taught by her mother, and another legendary priestess who came before named Sanite Dede, who apparently was a powerful healer, allegedly taught Marie Laveau a lot of her herb lore and things like that. So they would have definitely gone through a matrilineal lineage through family.
Yeah.
But there's not a whole lot of names that we would know about historically anymore, simply because they weren't able to read, they weren't able to write, nobody wrote their stories down. And today, voodoo is very much more up in the open, very much more. The actual, if you will, the Pope of voodoo, of all voodoo in the world, was in New Orleans about 5 years ago, just came to visit. Doesn't speak any English, of course. He's from Africa. He speaks African dialect of French. But a representative of the mayor came and offered him key to the city and, celebrated him. And it was neat. I was there at the ceremony. It was very, very cool. Having all these different people of pretty well-known voodoo families in New Orleans drumming and singing and dancing for him. And it was just a very cool little, positive, happy little ceremony. So that's the kind of stuff that goes on here. I think is really fun.
So they got a man pope, and I got to say that a lot of my thoughts of voodoo over the years has been women. Do women hold more of a place of reverence in voodoo than men, or is that just our interest in the underdog?
No, traditionally it's the case. In the voodoo tradition, the mambo, the female priest, is more powerful than the male priest. It's traditionally, that's just how it goes, and it goes that way all the way back to Africa. And what about, there aren't famous voodoo priests, but usually the priestess is considered the most powerful of one of the closest connection.
And what about white women? Is that I assume that's something that goes on today, but historically, was that something that didn't go on, wasn't allowed to go on, or just didn't go on because of separation?
In what way?
Like white women practicing voodoo, do you mean?
Yeah. Was this strictly a black or a mixed religion, or when did whiteness get I don't know how to ask the word. When did it become connected enough to the point where white people were a part of it, or was that always the case?
Well, in North America, it's going to be a different beast. New Orleans, as everything else, is just different. Voodoo was able to survive and thrive because it was able to hide itself in Catholicism without a problem at all. But we know in the 19th century there were big scandals because police raids would go out and break up these voodoo ceremonies in the Bayou St. John, and there'd be white women there at the voodoo rituals. And I think that was feminine rebellion. Feminine rebellion, joining this mystic religion, consorting with Africans at a time that was considered not to be done. Recently, it's only been relatively recently that people of European extraction, I think, have been welcomed into voodoo, or not, I wouldn't even say welcomed, but tolerated in voodoo.
Right.
I know some voodoo people have very strong beliefs on the religion, like it's not a religion for white people kind of beliefs. But I do know several, fervent practitioners, priests, mambos, who are definitely, European. And in New Orleans, they're certainly tolerated and accepted. So I would say, it's going to be an early 19th century thing, mid 19th century thing when there will be white devotees, and largely they're going to be women. And it's going to be, I think, as much as anything else, a societal rebellion that they can kind of secretly partake in.
Well, I can imagine that historically, when they went out there and broke these things up and found white women, that brought a level of ire and interest that probably not wanted at the time. All of a sudden, it's a threat to our white women.
Mhm.
And it becomes a much larger threat to the area where before it was sort of laughed off, maybe.
I wouldn't say laughed off, but it was seen as a curiosity.
Hmm.
Sundays were the days off of slaves, and they would gather in what we now call Armstrong Park, but it's called Congo Square, and they would trade and dance and sing and drum. But the white locals would oftentimes just show up and just kind of, to watch, to listen to the drumming and the singing and see the dancing and, kind of try and see what's going on. It was, a secret closely held amongst the slaves because Sunday was their day off by law. So it's the only time a slave didn't have to share their things was on Sunday.
Right.
It was said that when the priestesses would do their rituals in the square, they would have a bunch of very tall slaves, just essentially making a human fence between the quarter side of the square and their side of the square to keep them from being able to see for sure what was going on. And you also got to keep in mind, the Catholic Church for a very long time would have come down extremely hard on voodoo, as in, execution. This is heresy, whippings and execution, punishment, brutal punishments. So it was very much kind of a defense mechanism for them, but also they could practice their own religion and have something that's just theirs, that no white person could have or touch. So these all combined, I think, to really make voodoo thrive in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. Whereas the other parts of the world, it would have been stomped out. The other parts of North America would have been stomped out with extreme prejudice.
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah. Is there still a big racial divide in New Orleans today?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's still part of the United States.
Well, yes, I get that, but
it's sad because traditionally it's more of a class divide in New Orleans, really, for a very long time, because Black and white people all lived in the same neighborhood if they were in the same class. So downtown, my neighborhood, the Marigny, was essentially very mixed: Irish, German immigrants, Black people, descendants of some of the old French and Spanish families, Sicilians. They would all live up and down the same streets together, play in the streets together. It was because they're all working class people. So we have a little bit of advantage of that because it was traditionally much more class based. Big surprise, I think the American end of the city was not. I think it was very much more race based.
Right.
But where the Europeans kept more of a mix of people moving amongst themselves, drinking together, celebrating together. Mm-hmm. So I think that had a lot to do with it. And of course, in the South, matriarchy is still a very, very, very powerful thing. No matter how loud and proud they are, every Southern man is afraid of one old woman. Right. And that's the woman that runs the family.
Right.
That so, it still is very much a big, big deal here. The matriarchy aspect has a lot to do with everything. The joke is, when you ask a local who's got the best gumbo in the city, he's going to say, my mom.
Right.
or else, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
So, yeah, it's still a very strong thing in the city.
Yeah. What about women and hauntings? I assume that there's quite a few of those, given the tragic pasts of women in general throughout history, but
yeah, I mean,
specifically,
you could talk about there's a Julie is a very famous story, goes back well over 150 years, 200 years maybe, almost, about a young glacé, free woman of color, who, to prove her devotion to her paramour, froze to death on the rooftop in December of one year, about 1834. She literally put herself naked in a sleet storm to prove that she loved him enough to marry him, or for him to marry her. And as a result, she died of hypothermia on the rooftop. And that's a very old legend that goes back, and it's kind of a cool story because it describes, you can understand a little bit more about plaçage, the relationship, how it was done. The building that was their building is still there, and it's been reported, ghost activity in the building forever. Friends of mine actually live in a condo at the very top floor of that building, and they have ghost activity in the place all the time. So, that's a very old ghost story in New Orleans. One of my favorite people don't know about was a woman who came to New Orleans at the age of 16 with a child in her arms in 1726. And within 3 years of her arrival, her husband was part of a group of about 300 men, women, and children who were essentially ambushed by a couple of Indian tribes, outnumbered about almost 3 to 1, and almost none of them would have been armed. and they were killed almost all to the last person. But one of the charges involved were also cannibals. So we're talking torture, enslavement, and cannibalism in the 1720s, 1729.
Yeah.
And she, big surprise, while she had a very successful life, she made a successful life for her. She's one of my absolute favorite people. She still haunts her home. She still haunts that home that she died in. And the thing that's so cool is I've seen photographs of her, and when she's photographed, she not a 68-year-old woman. She would look like she was when she was 19, when her husband went away and never ever came home again.
Well, I'm looking forward to dying then, if that's what I get to look like.
Well, just saying, ghosts aren't trapped by time or place.
Yeah.
And of course, Delphine Laurie, the most infamous woman of New Orleans, the woman was immortalized by Kathy Bates in season 3 of American Horror Story Coven.
I've seen that.
She certainly was a torturer. She was a murderer of slaves, no doubt at all. And the home she did her activities, big surprise, is still very haunted, not only by the ghosts of slaves, but also by the ghosts of other people who lived there, including, I've been told, Delphine Laurie herself. I've got some friends who worked there very briefly. As in, one guy went in and quit at the end of his first day and refused to go back inside the building. So there are actually rather a lot of stories about ghost activity in New Orleans that involve women, without a doubt at all.
So this woman from American Horror Story, she was a real character. Did she really do this stuff to slaves?
There's some debate about that. Some people say that she was a victim of yellow journalism, personal jealousy. I mean, all that stuff could certainly have something to do with it, but we do have records. We do have records, and she was very much a person of interest. She was wanted. She was convicted of wrongful death, of murder of a slave, before all this stuff comes out. There's a lot of books about her. Some of them paint her in a better light, some of them paint her in a darker light. I personally think that she was probably what we call a psychosexual sadist, in that she derived physical pleasure from hurting other people. And slaves were the perfect opportunity. Her husband was a surgeon. So, and a lot of the reports of people found after they were discovered and fled the city imply a lot of surgical techniques, experimentation, vivisection, that kind of thing. So they would be the match made in hell. They'd be perfect for each other. One thing that was reported when she was the preeminent host of the city is she would welcome people into her beautiful home in a gorgeous gowns of watered silk from Paris. Then she would excuse herself from a party, be gone an hour or more, which would be wildly rude, and then would come down the staircase in a completely different gown. And people assumed that she was just being kind of a bitch and showing, rubbing everybody's nose and how much she had that they would never have.
Right.
But I have a horrible suspicion that she would be so aroused at her dark little secret, she would go upstairs, she would hurt people, and she would have to change.
Oh, I like that.
Because she would get
interesting.
People on her. So, I mean, it's
absolute power move to just come back down covered in blood, though.
Covered in chunks of people.
Yeah, but you can only do that once.
Yeah, you can only do it once. It's true.
That's the problem. But she's one of the most infamous people of our city, without a doubt. She's the stop that every single ghost tour, except for mine, thank you very much, talks about, because I don't talk about it. I had somebody ask about it the other day, and it's like it's like a Saw movie, except for it really happened.
Right.
Saw movies are fun for some people because it's a dark fantasy. But when it really happens, that is not as much fun to talk about.
Right.
See my point?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can talk about. I've got tons of stories I can talk about that nobody else knows except for me, that I can share with people. So it's much more fun, I think, to be able to tell people stories that, that woman I mentioned who was widowed at 19 because her husband was killed and eaten by cannibals. That's a remarkably cool story because it's a story of triumph over absolute and utter despair and ruination. I like telling people stories that will make them think or make them perhaps sympathize with a person who's been dead for 200 or more years. I like to put people in a position where they can think, well, what if that was me? Or I could be in that situation. I think it really sticks with people more, and they can really feel the story more than me just, shouting a bunch of nonsense about, torture and execution in a house that actually had a lot of torture and execution. It's making light of something that is horrific. And I cannot stand that. I really can't.
Well, I understand that. I'm a big horror movie fan, and I personally don't like the Saw movies. I like more supernatural, but they can get as crazy as they want to be, and I like them because they're fiction. But sometimes when I'm watching some of the true crime stuff, I'm a little turned off by it because of the reality of it.
Absolutely.
I don't mind when it's fantasy, but when it gets a little too gory and rapey and kitty and stuff, and it's reality, I'm just all like, good God, why am I even watching this? Is there something wrong with me?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's entirely reasonable, man. I'm right there with you the whole time. Show me a Conjuring movie any day, but
right, yeah.
Saw stuff is not my bag, man. I guess maybe because I live in a place that is so freaking real that I know stuff like that has really happened, and that's just too dark, Even for me, it's too dark.
Right.
But it's so cool in the city that we have such a luxury of women to talk about. If I do the Women in New Orleans tour, whenever I do the Women in New Orleans tour, I absolutely am going to talk about Delphine Lalaurie. I'm going to have to, because she's one of the most infamous women of the city of New Orleans, and absolutely shaped our culture from 1834 on, because she's been one of the most persistent boogeymen, if you will, boogie women, and ghost stories of the city of New Orleans since 1830s. So, and that's the one everybody knows about because of American Horror Story, stuff like that.
You got to play the hits.
Have to talk to her, but I'm hoping to be able to talk to her about her in a historical context. Maybe hopefully trying to figure out why she was this way. I hope, and give people a little more idea of what this person was. She would have had every single advantage possible to a woman for that time period. I think she and her husband were arguably, if not the richest people in a third of North America, right up there in the top 5. Incalculable wealth and power for the time. I suspect her family knew about her proclivities.
It's hard to hide when you're in the house.
Well, I mean, her extended family.
I see.
I suspect she might have also been extremely frightening and abusive to her daughters, because her daughters, who should have been awful little monsters, being spoiled and rich, were apparently notoriously shy and retiring and quiet. So I think she was literally an ogress, just running a household with absolutely no restraint. And she was like a wicked witch from Hansel and Gretel, almost,
right.
A woman with very, very few redeeming qualities. But you know what I find so interesting about that is you got to realize that Marie Laveau and Delphine Lalaurie would have absolutely known who each other were. They would have gone to the same cathedral for mass together. It's not unlikely that Marie Laveau did Delphine Lalaurie's hair on more than one occasion, because she's a hairdresser to the high society ladies.
Right.
So, I mean, it's just crazy to think about these women. One who essentially is a powerful, if you will, almost voodoo saint, and another one who is absolutely and utterly dark. Not only knowing each other, but crossing paths repeatedly and going to the same cathedral for mass together.
So I guess I didn't make the connection that they would be alive at the same time. Was this
absolutely?
Was this a golden age of history in New Orleans for both of them to be alive at the same time? Is this an era that we draw a lot of history from, or is that purely coincidental?
No, and you're right. It's an area we draw a lot of history from. The increased Americanization of New Orleans after 1803, and also the explosion of traffic on the Mississippi River, would have made us an absolute focal point for anybody traveling from Europe to North America. Is almost without exception going to go to New Orleans. Reporters, all kinds of. We had multiple newspapers in several different languages, so there's increased literacy at the time period. So people are able to keep their own journals and diaries and write letters more often. So that's really the golden era for history, because we get so much good history from that time period. At the same time, it's so far removed, it's a little bit hazy, if you will, in our mind's eye. So it's a lot of fun to kind of try and put these people together at the same time. I suspect that Marie Laveau, Delphine Lalaurie, the Pirate King Jean Lafitte and Andrew Jackson were all at the same church together at the same time.
Hmm.
There were 4 very notorious characters of the city's history.
Right.
It's very likely they would all sit at the same cathedral at the same time together.
Man, that's a movie right there too.
Yep. New Orleans is nothing but the most amazing series of movies and TV shows
Yeah.
that nobody ever makes.
Yeah.
Well, you're the holder of the knowledge. Why aren't you making these movies?
Hollywood, if you need somebody to consult, I've done it before.
Yeah, all the Netflix execs who listen to our show, please.
And there's tons of them, I'm sure.
Find Jonathan
Totally.
Weiss.
Yeah.
Right.
He's available to consult.
Biggest damn show on the internet.
Yeah, it really is neat because I always thought something like a little more daring company like HBO.
Yeah, exactly.
It just seems like such a natural to set a historical drama in New Orleans.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Because you would have the glittering high society of, pre-antebellum, pre-Civil War, glittering high society, and absolute squalor, who would literally live a block and a half apart from each other.
Right. And racism abound, undergrounds where women and Black characters can thrive. Yeah, just great opportunity there. Great
and also the mixing of races. Like I said, the class mixing of races.
Yeah.
We had extremely violent street gangs in the city. I mean, savage Irish street gangs like would come out of the 5 Points, right? You got Bridget Fury and Bricktop Mary and their little cabal of extremely violent prostitutes, who the first female street gang, right?
That's the one I want to see the most. That's the movie we've covered.
I think it'd be fascinating, wouldn't it? It really would be cool. It'd be like Deadwood, just set about 40 years earlier.
I really
That'd be
want, like,
one hell of a show, wouldn't it?
Just like Fargo, but set in New Orleans. Just
Yeah.
a comedy of errors kind of thing that turns into, unbelievable.
It's one of the coolest things about the city is the things I think I mentioned to you before, but the things that actually happened. If you read it in a movie, or if you read it in a book or saw it in a movie, you wouldn't believe it. Right. But it really happened. We know it happened. Yeah. It's just absolutely impossible to wrap your head around the sheer improbability of the city, and yet the fact that it's not only thrived but has been tried to be. We feel like the gods try to wipe us off the map for 300 years, and yet we just won't go. Right. And I always thought, kind of tongue in cheek, it's like, because nobody else would let us in. That's what it is.
Right.
We built our own little strange insular community that's got our own very specific rules and culture, and it's just its own little place. So,
I would like to see Mardi Gras spread across the country, though. That is a holiday I'd like to see the rest of the country celebrate. And
the sad thing is, it won't work because the rest of the country is Protestant.
They're what?
I guess so.
Protestants.
Oh,
Mardi Gras is a Catholic holiday.
Yeah.
It's it literally is based on old Catholic principles. Old Catholic beginning of the Lenten season with Ash Wednesday, the day after Mardi Gras.
We do Halloween. I mean, nobody cares about that.
Yeah, I don't think Americans have a huge problem with taking holidays without
butchering
any
them.
understanding of their historical or religious context.
Yeah, what
Patrick's Day? What?
Yeah, what Mardi Gras needs is like its own Santa Claus figure from Macy's in order to sell presents.
Oh my God!
Some sort of giant cake with a baby in it or something.
Chauncey, I want you to keep your dirty American hands off. If you want to have a Mardi Gras, you have it in your house, or you come and visit us. But that's the only way you do it. We don't allow any other Mardi Gras.
We'll talk about this in the neutral zone. Was that the right word?
Neutral ground.
Yeah,
neutral ground. Right. Exactly right, man.
All right. Well, we're at the end here. I really appreciate you coming on. Man, you always got the greatest stories, and there's just so much going on there. And I really appreciate you coming on, especially a second time. You've been listening to Jonathan Weiss here. We've been talking about Women of NOLA. That's New Orleans, Louisiana. And if you're interested in finding out more about him and his tours, your best place is to go to jonathanweisstours.com. Weiss is spelt with the W, like the German. And check it out. For one, it's a great looking website. If nothing else, you got some great photography going on there.
Thank you.
SEO brain popping in.
Yeah.
I respect that, my friend.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, and we're always happy to have you.